The flashlight hit his face before he even had a chance to speak. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer barked, hand already on his weapon. No questions, no ID check, just the unshakable suspicion of a black man in a Cadillac at midnight. Judge Malcolm Hayes raised his hand slowly, calmly, and said the words they refused to hear. "I live here. I'm a judge." It was close to midnight in Frisco, Texas, the kind of quiet that blankets a neighborhood just before the world exhales into sleep. The porch lights were dimming, TVs flickered behind drawn curtains, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional hum of a distant car. Judge Malcolm Hayes, 59 years old, leaned back in the driver's seat of his black Cadillac, parked right outside his home. He wasn't rushing to get out. The house was dark, but not empty. His adult children were visiting. Laughter had filled the rooms earlier, but Malcolm needed a minute. A long night of bittersweet farewells had left him emotionally spent. One of his closest colleagues on the bench had just retired, and after the speeches and the hugs and the "you better keep in touch," he'd driven home with Miles Davis whispering through the speakers, the scent of old leather and jasmine from his daughter's car freshener still lingering. He wore khakis and a faded hoodie from his alma mater, nothing that screamed "Your Honor," not that it should have mattered. Not here. Not in front of his own house. He closed his eyes for a second, not to sleep, just to breathe. But peace, it turned out, had a short leash that night. Blue and red lights suddenly painted the interior of his car in sharp, pulsing strokes. No sirens. Just that cold flash of authority. Malcolm opened his eyes, hand still on the wheel, and stared at the rearview mirror. Two white officers emerged from the squad car. One approached the driver's side with a flashlight already up, the other circled toward the passenger side. The light hit Malcolm's face, blinding him for a second. He rolled down the window halfway, calmly. "Evening, officers. Is there a problem?" No greeting. No explanation. Just a clipped command. "Turn off the engine. Keep your hands where we can see them." Malcolm nodded, reaching slowly to shut off the car. His voice was steady, his movements measured. He'd worked enough cases to know what not to do. "I live here," he said, tilting his head toward the front porch. "You can check the mailbox, or I can show you my ID." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he shined the flashlight into the back seat, then barked out, "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "I'm a sitting judge," he said, not as a threat, just a fact. "You may want to out now," the officer snapped. Malcolm hesitated, just for a second. But that second was enough. The officer yanked open the door and grabbed Malcolm's arm. "What are you doing?" Malcolm asked, raising both hands. "I haven't done anything wrong." The second cop had his hand on his holster now. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting. I'm identifying myself." But they weren't listening. A knee pressed into his back. His cheek hit cold metal. His hands were wrenched behind him. "You're under arrest for failure to comply with a lawful order," one of them said flatly. A neighbor's light flicked on across the street. A silhouette moved behind the curtains. Another door creaked open. No one said anything, but the whole block was suddenly awake. Judge Malcolm Hayes, 59 years old, father of 3, veteran of the bench, respected in legal circles from Austin to D.C., was now just a suspicious black man in a luxury vehicle being handcuffed in front of his own home. They never asked his name. Never checked his ID. The Cadillac's engine had barely cooled before he was shoved into the back of the squad car. The station on Maplewood was small and dimly lit, fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead like flies that refused to die. The coffee in the vending machine smelled burnt. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody offered to call his family. No one asked if he needed a lawyer. They bagged his belongings, watch, wallet, keys. One officer tossed his driver's license into the evidence tray but didn't even glance at it. Malcolm sat in a holding cell with 3 others, one man asleep, another pacing, a third muttering to himself. The concrete bench was cold and unforgiving. His back ached. His hands were stiff from the cuffs. 6 hours passed like slow poison. Twice, Malcolm asked to speak to a supervisor. The desk officer waved him off both times. The third time, Malcolm stood up, walked to the bars, and said calmly, "I am Judge Malcolm Hayes. Call your supervisor." The officer didn't even look up. "Yeah? And I'm the governor. Take a seat." Nobody looked at him. Nobody looked at anyone. They didn't have to. In that moment, he was nobody. Just another file. Just another body. It wasn't until 7:10 a.m., 6 hours and 12 minutes after they pulled him from his own car, that someone in records finally scanned the ID that had been sitting in the tray all night. The scanner beeped. The clerk paused. Then moved quickly. A higher-ranking officer showed up 10 minutes later, face tight, voice clipped, apology rehearsed and meaningless. "You're being released. No charges filed. Mistaken identity. Precautionary arrest." Malcolm didn't respond. He took his belongings silently, watch, phone, keys. Walked out the station doors. The morning sun was already rising, casting a gold haze over the quiet street. He called a cab and rode home without a word. But his silence didn't mean surrender. That afternoon, his attorney filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. Not just for wrongful arrest, but for racial profiling, excessive force, and negligence. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked. "You know how they'll spin it. People will say you're bitter because you didn't get special treatment." Malcolm's voice was steady, but something behind it cracked. "I don't want special treatment. I want what every black man should get. Dignity. Respect. Basic decency. And they gave me none of that." She paused. "All right then. We'll see it through." And just like that, the fire was lit. By nightfall, the news had broken. Frisco judge wrongfully arrested by police in front of his own home. The headline raced through local stations, then statewide. They showed his mugshot, his bruised wrist, his face still calm, but clearly worn. People were stunned, but not shocked. Especially not the black community. Because this wasn't new. It just finally happened to someone with the power to speak out. The department scrambled. Promised internal review. Released a statement about standard procedure and unfortunate misunderstandings. But what they didn't expect, what no one expected, was who would be sitting on the bench the following Monday morning when Detectives Daniel Reeves and Tyler Moore walked into the Internal Affairs hearing. Courtroom 3C. The plaque read, Judge Malcolm Hayes. The same man they pinned against the hood of his own car. The same man they hadn't even bothered to ask for a name. He didn't look at them when they entered. He simply tapped the gavel once, leaned into the mic, and said calmly, "Court is now in session." Malcolm didn't sleep that night. Even after the cab dropped him off, even after he showered, changed, and sat alone at his kitchen table with the lights off and the sound of birds beginning to chirp outside the window. The silence in the house felt heavier than the holding cell. The images from the night before looped through his mind, the cold metal of the hood against his cheek, the bite of handcuffs, the officer's voice barking orders like he was already guilty of something. The part that stayed with him the most wasn't the arrest. It wasn't even the pain in his wrist or the look in his neighbor's window. It was the way they hadn't cared. Not for a second. They hadn't asked his name. Hadn't asked for ID. Hadn't listened when he told them who he was. They hadn't seen a judge, a father, a man. Just a black face behind the wheel of a Cadillac past midnight. And that, more than anything, was what lit the fire. By 10 a.m., a formal complaint had already been filed. Malcolm's attorney, Denise Lang, was relentless. Sharp, methodical, with a voice that didn't rise but cut. She drafted 3 separate filings, one for excessive force, one for racial profiling, and one for unlawful arrest without cause. "You sure you want to push this?" she asked again, seated across from him at his dining table. "This'll be messy. The department's going to circle the wagons. They'll say it was protocol, that you weren't cooperative." Malcolm looked at her with a steady calm that had defined his courtroom demeanor for decades. Then they'll have to answer for their version of protocol. Denise didn't smile, but her eyes lit up with something fierce. Good, she said. Because we're not letting this go quietly. By afternoon, the press got hold of the story. The headline ran across the evening news: Frisco judge wrongfully arrested outside his own home. The mugshot leaked. Malcolm's face, unsmiling, surrounded by a dull gray background, was now front-page material. His name trended on Twitter. And while many expressed outrage, the ones who mattered most, the ones in his community, weren't surprised. They were just tired. Tired of another mistake, tired of seeing educated, peaceful, accomplished black men reduced to suspects at a glance. But there was one twist no one saw coming. Monday morning, Courtroom 3C was scheduled for an internal affairs disciplinary hearing for the two officers involved, Detectives Daniel Reeves and Tyler Moore. They were expected to appear with legal counsel. What they didn't know, what nobody outside a very small circle knew, was that the presiding officer on the bench would be none other than Judge Malcolm Hayes himself. That morning, Malcolm stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, staring out at the very driveway where it all began. The same Cadillac still parked there. Same jazz station playing low from inside. Only now, the man who had been silenced was about to be the one with the gavel. When he entered the courthouse, heads turned. Not out of fear, but out of respect. And maybe a little uncertainty. Would he step down from the case? Would he recuse himself? Would he let emotion drive the day? Malcolm didn't say a word to any of them. He just walked through the halls in that quiet, unshakable way that had made his name. When the doors to Courtroom 3C opened at 9 a.m., it was standing room only. Journalists packed the back row. A few local leaders were present, members of the Bar Association, even a state representative. The buzz in the room died instantly when the officers walked in and saw the nameplate on the bench, Judge Malcolm L. Hayes. The silence that followed was the kind that made skin crawl. Daniel Reeves froze mid-step. Tyler Moore turned ghost white. Their attorney, a young man in an ill-fitted navy suit, fumbled with his notes. Malcolm entered a moment later, wearing the black robe he had earned over 25 years of service. He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and tapped the gavel once. This hearing is now in session, he said. Calm. Unmoved. Absolute. The courtroom didn't breathe. We are here to examine the conduct of Detectives Reeves and Moore during the detainment and arrest of a private citizen on the evening of Friday, May 14th, he continued, eyes locked forward. I will not be recusing myself. As the individual directly involved in the incident, I have disclosed all relevant conflicts. Neither party has filed objection. He paused. So we proceed. The first to testify was a neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, who had watched the arrest from her window. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. I saw Mr. Hayes sitting in his car, parked where he always does, she said. Then the lights flashed, and the next thing I know they're pulling him out like he's some criminal. I knew it was him. He always waves when I walk my dog. Always polite. But they didn't ask anything. Next came the video. No sound at first. Just shaky footage from the body cam, the beam of a flashlight, the dark silhouette of the Cadillac, the calm profile of Malcolm in the driver's seat. Then audio kicked in. Evening, officers. Is there a problem? Turn off the engine. I live here. I can show you my ID. Step out of the vehicle. I'm a sitting judge. The courtroom was dead silent. Malcolm never flinched. He just let the footage play. The moment the officer grabbed his wrist. The shove. The metal. The cuffs. After the final clip ended, Malcolm leaned forward and addressed the officers directly. Detective Reeves. Detective Moore. Would either of you like to make a statement? Reeves cleared his throat. Your Honor, we responded to a call about a suspicious vehicle. It was dark. The subject refused to exit the vehicle. We followed protocol. Did he identify himself? He said he was a judge, but you didn't verify. We didn't think it was credible. Because he was sitting in a car outside a home? Yes, sir. Was there any indication of a crime? No, sir. So what made him suspicious? Silence. Moore shifted in his seat. Detective Moore, Malcolm said, turning to him now, if I had been a white man in that car wearing the same hoodie, would we be here today? Moore hesitated. I don't know, Your Honor. Exactly. Malcolm let the words hang in the air. Then he looked out across the courtroom. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about payback. But when law enforcement forgets to ask the most basic question, who are you, and moves straight to force, we've crossed the line. He turned back to the officers. You didn't see a threat. You saw a black man in a nice car and made a choice. One that could have cost someone their life. He paused. Lucky for you, the man you cuffed knew the law better than you did. There was no outburst. No applause. Just silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. Righteous. I'll be making my recommendation by the end of the week, Malcolm said, rising from his bench. Court is adjourned. The gavel hit once more, but its echo lingered like thunder in the room. Outside, the press was waiting. Cameras clicked. Reporters shouted. But Malcolm walked past all of them. Not because he didn't have anything to say, he just believed the most powerful thing he could do had already been done. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scream. He simply told the truth. And he did it from the one place they couldn't ignore, the bench. The moment Judge Malcolm Hayes walked out of that courtroom after presiding over the disciplinary hearing, the cameras were waiting, but he didn't stop. He didn't need to. What needed to be said had already been delivered not through a press conference or a raised voice, but from the bench, with composure sharper than any outrage. His decision wasn't vengeance. It was justice filtered through restraint. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled people the most. Inside the courthouse, the officers and internal affairs investigators were still digesting what had unfolded. Malcolm's final words echoed in their minds like a weight. I don't want apologies you don't mean. I want change. And I want you to carry the weight of this moment every time you flash a badge. For a moment, it felt like the air had thickened around them, pressing down with the reality of accountability. But Malcolm didn't stay to bask in the discomfort. He returned to his chambers as he always did, robe folded neatly, the nameplate on his desk turned once again to face the room, Judge Malcolm L. Hayes. It was the same office he had occupied for nearly 2 decades, but that morning it felt different. The silence inside wasn't heavy like before, it was purposeful. A reflection of the clarity that comes when a man knows he did exactly what was right, even if others wanted blood. The phone buzzed. Denise Lang, his attorney and longtime friend, had already left a voicemail. You handled that with grace, Malcolm. Proud to know you. He sat at his desk for a while, letting the dust settle. It would have been easy to throw the book at those officers, and no one would have blamed him. The public would have cheered. Headlines would have praised him as a force for reckoning. But deep down, Malcolm knew what true justice required. Not humiliation. Not destruction. Transformation. So when he drafted his final report that afternoon, the recommendations were clear: 30-day unpaid suspensions for both officers. Immediate. Enrollment in mandatory de-escalation training. Department-wide racial bias retraining, from cadets to captains. No soft warnings. No slaps on the wrist. Structural change. He wrote each word with surgical precision. Not for optics. For outcome. Within hours, the city released a public statement. The media, hungry for a harsher headline, called the ruling measured. Some activists said it didn't go far enough. Others called it a masterstroke of moral clarity. But Malcolm didn't read the op-eds. He watched the ripple in the system. 3 days later, The police chief held a closed-door meeting with department leadership. Internal memos were sent. Training schedules restructured. Oversight committees expanded. Quiet reforms began taking root because one judge refused to let things slide under the rug. When Malcolm walked back into courtroom 3C the following week, he noticed it immediately. The bailiff stood a little straighter. The two patrol officers present for the morning's docket walked in without their usual casual swagger. They didn't avoid eye contact, but they didn't offer fake smiles either. Just a quiet, respectful nod. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. That they'd stood in front of someone who had not only lived the injustice they often dismissed, but who still believed enough in the law to wield it with integrity. The docket moved as usual. Civil claims. A landlord dispute. A minor weapons possession case. But after court adjourned and the room emptied, Malcolm gathered his files slowly. That's when he noticed the boy. 17, maybe 18. Hoodie. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Standing near the side exit, hesitating. Malcolm tilted his head. "Can I help you?" The boy cleared his throat. I just wanted to say thank you, sir. I saw you on TV." Malcolm gave a small nod. "Appreciate that." The boy stepped forward, still unsure of himself. "It meant something, the way you handled it. You didn't yell. You didn't try to make them feel small. You just stood your ground. Showed what real power looks like." Malcolm looked at him for a long moment, then asked gently, "You thinking about going into law?" The boy nodded. "I want to. I didn't think it was for people like me, but after seeing you, maybe it is." Malcolm smiled, a quiet one. "Then don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And don't ever think that your worth comes from how loud you are. Sometimes it's in how still you stay." The boy's shoulders lifted a little. "Thanks, Judge Hayes." "What's your name, son?" "Marcus." "Well, Marcus, make sure you remember this, skin like ours will always mean something to some people. But it never has to define what you become." The boy nodded again, this time with something steadier in his eyes. He turned and walked off, but not before Malcolm saw the way he squared his shoulders, like a boy who'd been seen, not judged. And for Malcolm, that mattered more than any headline. Later that week, Malcolm was invited to speak at a legal symposium on judicial conduct. He declined. He didn't need a stage. The real work was already unfolding. In the weeks that followed, changes began showing up in subtle but undeniable ways. Community forums on police accountability had record attendance. Officers were observed using more verbal engagement techniques and stops. A new pilot program, mandatory racial bias awareness workshops, was implemented across 2 precincts. Small steps, but not insignificant ones. Malcolm's choice, to lead with restraint instead of retaliation, had started something. Not a media storm, but a movement. Quiet. Purposeful. Exactly the way he preferred it. He didn't want to be remembered as the judge who clapped back. He wanted to be remembered as the judge who showed what justice could look like when wielded with discipline and humanity. As weeks turned into months, Malcolm's days returned to their rhythm. But the respect in the room when he took the bench never quite went back to what it was. It had deepened. Grounded itself in something more than title. One afternoon, while heading to his car, he passed a group of young students on a courthouse tour. One of them turned and called out, "Hey, Judge Hayes. You really put those cops in their place, huh?" Malcolm stopped, turned slightly, and smiled. "No," he said. "I put the law in its place." The students laughed, a few nodding with admiration. But the lesson lingered. Because that's what Malcolm wanted people to understand. Justice wasn't about spectacle. It was about weight, about knowing when to let silence speak louder than fury. And about remembering that the most radical thing a black man could do in a broken system was refuse to be broken by it. That night, at home, he sat in his study reading a handwritten letter from a woman in Mississippi. She was a retired schoolteacher, said she'd watched the hearing online. Her words were simple: "Thank you for not letting them turn you into what they wanted to see. You reminded my grandson what dignity looks like." Malcolm folded the letter and tucked it into his desk drawer with the others. Not because he needed the praise, but because those letters reminded him why it mattered. Because change didn't come in one verdict. It came in moments like that. In lessons passed from judge to boy, from silence to reform, from one decision made not out of rage, but restraint. And in that, Judge Malcolm Hayes found peace. Because dignity, when chosen over anger, doesn't make you weaker. It makes you unstoppable. And justice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, through silence, through assumptions, through the quiet decisions made in the shadows of authority. When I sat down to write the story of Judge Malcolm Hayes, I didn't just want to tell a tale of a wrongful arrest. I wanted to shine a light on something deeper, what it truly means to carry power with restraint, and how dignity, even when tested, can become a form of resistance. Judge Hayes didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist on the bench. He didn't demand vengeance when it was well within his reach. Instead, he chose clarity. He chose discipline. And in doing so, he taught us that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that speaks with calm conviction, not volume. Too often, we're taught that justice must roar. That to fight back means to strike harder, speak louder, shame faster. But the lesson here is something far more profound. Real change doesn't always come from rage, it often comes from restraint. From the decision to stand firm in who you are, even when the world tries to reduce you to a stereotype. Malcolm Hayes didn't just hold those officers accountable. He held a mirror up to an entire system. And then, he gave it a chance to do better. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. That's leadership. That's justice. To those listening, especially to the young men and women who've been told, directly or indirectly, that they are only seen through the lens of fear or assumption, remember this: your value is not up for debate. You are more than what the world may expect of you, and your strength does not have to roar to be real. Sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is not to react, but to rise, to remain whole, and to show the world your full self with unwavering pride. And to those who hold power, whether it's a badge, a gavel, a uniform, or simply a platform, this is a call to examine how you use it. What you allow. What you let slide. What you assume before you ask a single question. On behalf of U.S. Justice Story, thank you for staying with us through this powerful journey. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. Because justice isn't just about courts and laws, it's about the choices we make every day, especially when no one's watching. Until next time, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And most of all, thank you for not staying silent.